evening's Jerusalem Press Club online briefing. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Talia Deckel, and the JPC has graciously hired me this month to lead its press work. I look forward to being in contact with each and every one of you. So let's dive into our topic today. As we all know, the imminent annexation or application of Israeli law to areas in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria is keeping the region on its toes, to say the least. Since it's been in the headlines, the Press Club has hosted a number of webinars on this topic specifically, and you can find them on our YouTube channel. Starting today, we're actually launching a new series dedicated entirely to understanding the various opinions on the matter, as well as the domestic, regional, and global implications for such a move. Today's guest speaker is Professor Chuck Freilich, Israel's Deputy National Security Advisor from 2000 to 2005. He's a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and teaches political science at NYU, Columbia, and Tel Aviv universities. Professor Freilich is the author of 3 books, has published hundreds of articles and op-eds, and is regularly interviewed on these issues. Chuck, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and congratulations on your new position.
Thank you very much. So let's just begin with an opening statement before we get into the questions.
Okay, good morning everyone. For anyone expecting a happy and optimistic presentation, you're in the wrong place. I think that Israel faces a potentially perfect storm, partly of its own making, and partly because of events that are either beyond its control or unrelated, but have an important effect on us. And let me start with a few regional developments, and then I'll come to Israel specifically. First of all, the regional turmoil that began with the so-called Arab Spring, as far as I'm concerned, it's just begun, and it's going to be with us for decades. The region is going to continue to erupt. For the same reasons that led to the original Arab Spring, the lack of economic opportunity and truly horrific unemployment around the region, the population explosion, the absence of political freedoms. In the last year, we saw people speaking of a second Arab Spring, and we saw regime change in Sudan and Algeria. Add to this the collapse in oil prices, the corona crisis. It makes the problem of regional turmoil even greater. And the truth is that all of the countries, or nearly all of the countries in the region, either already are or on the verge of deep crisis. Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen devastated by civil wars. Lebanon just defaulted on its national debt. Saudi Arabia and Iran are undergoing severe crises, maybe the worst they've ever faced. And if you want, I can elaborate on that in the Q&A. Turkey isn't doing so well either. And the regional trends today, following the international corona crisis, will have a severe impact on regional developments. International recovery will affect regional recovery. The international community is preoccupied today by the crisis. So for better and worse, it has less time to devote, less attention to the Middle East, less able to play a moderating role in the region. Does the double whammy of the corona and economic crisis lead the US to reduce its regional presence even more? Do Russia and China increasingly fill the vacuum? It's not clear if these regional crises produce greater moderation or just the opposite, conflict, whether it works to Israel's favor or not. To a certain extent, you can make both arguments. I think regional instability rarely plays in Israel's favor. And then add to that one other crisis, which has extraordinarily important ramifications for Israel, but which Israel is not a direct party to, and that's an imminent crisis, an impending crisis between the US and Iran. Now, Iran has essentially limited all of the restrictions under the nuclear deal following the US withdrawal. The two sides have exchanged a series of military blows in the last year. The US has ramped up pressure even more, not just the economic sanctions, but it's now talking about an extension of the sanctions on arms sales, conventional arms sales to Iran, which were due to expire in October. Basically, both of the sides have used up much, if not most, of the maneuvering room that they have for limited military and diplomatic action. Now, the showdown, I mean, it's brewing, and because the sanctions on the conventional arms are due to expire in October, that may be the crisis point. And if it is, it's just on the eve of the American elections, and of course that feeds into it. And next year there are presidential elections in Iran. All of this have vast ramifications for Israel. Now let me turn to 4 crises of our own. First of all, the political judicial crisis. The formation of the new government did not resolve this problem or this crisis. At best, it's a temporary and partial respite, very temporary. For the prime minister, the new government has one overriding prerogative, and that's to best position himself for the legal battle he faces, for trying to delegitimize and discredit the legal system, including the Supreme Court, to do everything in the most unrestrained manner to keep himself out of jail. This is an intentional creation of political chaos for those like myself who used to be junkies of House of Cards. They never got close to what may be happening here. The political judicial crisis that we face is likely to shake Israel's foundations to their core and overshadow and harm our ability to address everything else. And there are important national security and domestic crises to address. Not just the political judicial one, but now the economic crisis as a result of Corona. The stimulus packages that the government has introduced have so far proven insufficient to jumpstart the economy, and the government's ability to do a lot more is limited. Unemployment is severe, and in the summer, in the next month or two, the unemployment benefits are going to run out, and the reality of the crisis, that this isn't just something temporary, is going to set in, and at that point, the Corona crisis, the economic crisis, starts becoming a political crisis. So the prime minister may be riding very high in the polls today, but that may not necessarily be the case in a few months. And that's one of the reasons I believe that he wanted the national unity government, so that he could share responsibility. Annexation is a self-made crisis. Now, we don't know what the annexation is yet. And it is possible that, as people on the right in Israel hope, that the reaction will be muted, that it will be something akin to the reaction after the Trump recognition of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. That's certainly possible. The Arab world has never been weaker, less capable of mounting an effective response. Iran is partly distracted by its own Corona and economic crises, the same for Europe and the international community. So maybe the response will be muted. I tend to think that it will be far more severe than that, and maybe quite severe. Jordan and Egypt will be forced to downgrade the relationships with us today and possibly abrogate the peace treaties. Europe and other countries will at least impose some sanctions, and there will be a severe deterioration of relations on the diplomatic level. There is potential for escalation on all fronts: Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranians in Syria, and of course the Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, some of this might have happened in the next few months in any event, but certainly given the annexation, the likelihood is much greater. And this summer, we could find ourselves in a multi-front confrontation, such as Israel has never faced since the War of Independence. The PA, the Palestinian Authority, has already announced the cessation of security cooperation. And if there is significant violence and terrorism, the IDF will be forced to step in. It may reoccupy additional parts of the West Bank beyond the planned annexation. The result can be growing chaos and violence. The PA may collapse or self-dismantle itself. And the end result of a partial annexation can be that the thing snowballs and becomes complete annexation. This may actually be exactly what the right wing in Israel is hoping will happen. That Palestinian hopes of ever establishing a state in the West Bank will be dealt a knockout blow. Consequent unrest in Jordan leads to the collapse of the monarchy and the Palestinian state being established in Jordan.
Chuck, I'm gonna stop you there because we do have a couple of questions and our time is limited.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for the very optimistic forecast. It's a great way to continue the week. You mentioned the fact that annexation may lead to an immediate violent backlash from the Islamic world and other diplomatic developments, specifically with Jordan and Egypt and perhaps other Arab states. But how would this specific move be any different from the events that followed the transfer of the U.S. Embassy, for instance, to Jerusalem, which was also feared as a game changer at the time?
Well, I think you can make the case, and I said it because we don't know. You can make the case that the response in the end will be the same thing. I said the Arab world has never been weaker and less capable of mounting an effective response, and that's true somewhat less, but it's true of Iran as well. At the same time, this is a different move. This is a final status move on Israel's part. This isn't the US coming and saying, well, the embassy or the Golan, everybody knows that the Golan is part of Israel. As a matter of fact, to a certain extent, that was a counterproductive measure on our part because nobody had talked about the Golan for decades. Here we're coming and taking an issue that is at the heart of international attention, less so in recent years. We're bringing it back onto the international stage by taking a final status measure. We're predetermining the final outcome of negotiations. Now, for the last 30 years, just about, since the beginning of the Oslo process, the events in the region, peace talks, the peace process have been predicated on the assumption that neither side takes steps that predetermine the final status. That has to be negotiated. So this is a different order completely, order of magnitude.
Okay, so I mean, currently the plan obviously is in support of and maybe even at the behest of the U.S. government. Do you think Israel is prepared for an about-face on annexation if President Trump perhaps isn't reelected again in November? And how could this impact U.S. support of Israel? Could we see an end to military support or otherwise?
Look, I think there was going to be tremendous pressure on American foreign aid starting next year, meaning the American fiscal year begins in the fall, October. I think we were going to see tremendous pressure on foreign aid in any event because of the American economic crisis as a result of the corona crisis. And the first place that people like to cut is foreign aid because the American public actually hates foreign aid, thinks it's much more than it really is. Israel might have been an exception to that rule had it not been for this annexation now. Even President Trump is going to have a hard time protecting Israel from the cuts because it's probably going to be across the board. Now, if Mr. Biden is elected, the pressures will grow. In the recent campaign, the electoral campaign, we saw for the first time in the history of the US-Israeli relationship, 3 leading Democratic presidential candidates calling for aid to Israel to be made contingent on a change in its policies on the West Bank. That was before annexation. We have seen in the last couple of years a dramatic drop in support for Israel on the Democratic side, especially the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Now, one of the secrets, so to speak, of the US-Israeli relationship was the fact that it was bipartisan. And here we've seen this truly horrifying drop. You also have to take into account, by the way, that the American Jewish community is overwhelmingly Democratic. And this is going to come back to haunt us. There will already be pressures if Mr. Biden is elected, and if not, in 4 years, 8 years, the Democratic president, sooner or later, there may be a Democratic Congress already this November.
Understood. You mentioned Iran as a relevant threat to Israel in the context of tensions specifically between Washington and Tehran. Given the recent discovery of the plan to poison our water supply, its continued pursuit of nuclear weapons, continued funding of Hezbollah and other terrorists at our door, doesn't Iran continue to pose an existential threat to Israel directly?
Absolutely. I was just saying that the reasons for the crisis, there may be a crisis between the US and Iran in coming months. And of course, that's in addition to growing tensions between Israel and Iran. You mentioned the cyber attack, but that's one potential source of conflict. The other source is what's happening in Syria. Despite maybe by now it's closer to 3 years of Israeli efforts to interdict Iran's buildup in Syria, its efforts really to turn Syria into a forward operating base against us. We've actually been quite successful, but it's an uphill battle, and you can even make the argument that it's a losing battle, because as long as Iran is determined, well, let me make up a figure. Let's say we've been successful in interdicting, destroying 90% of their efforts. Well, that's 10% a year. That succeeds. And the fact is they do have a military presence in Syria today, and I believe it's growing. I'm normally the guy who advocates restraint and moderation, and that's a good thing to do in this case as well. We cannot allow Iran to turn Syria into another Lebanon, into a forward operating base. And if that requires ongoing military action, if it requires the war, then that unfortunately may have to be the case.
Okay, so we talked a lot about Israel's enemies in the immediate region, in the Middle East. Let's say a word about countries who perhaps continue to intervene in the area from further away. Do you foresee a problem between Israel and Russia with their military advancement off the coast of Beirut, or even in continued involvement in Syria or otherwise?
Russia is taking advantage of the American vacuum in the Mideast. I think, as a matter of fact, if you want to sum up Russian national security policy today, you could almost do it in one sentence, which is to stick it to the US anywhere they can. And the Mideast happens to be one of the primary regions where they can. So like it or not, Russia is a major player today. And whereas in years past, Israel's modus operandi, the first thing we ever did was to run to Washington about every issue. We still do that, but the help that we can get is much more limited. So we have to work with Russia like it or not. Now, we have some shared interests with the Russians in Syria. We both want calm, okay? Now, neither side wants to see conflict there. The Russians, because they're trying to ensure that the Assad regime remains firmly in power, and because they want to be the power broker in Syria. So there's a little bit of a gap between them and Iran. Still a strong alliance between the two, but there is a gap of interest between them. We, of course, want to maintain calm on the Syrian border, but also to limit the Iranian presence to the degree we can. Russia undertook, I guess it must be about 2 years now, to keep Iranian and Hezbollah forces away from the border, 80 kilometers, haven't lived up to that. We don't have a better alternative today. The alternative is our own military action, so we're doing that in a limited fashion, under the radar to the extent possible, and I think we should continue doing that. But other than that, I mean, it's that or war or working with Russia. And Russia is, of course, a big player on the Iranian nuclear issue because it's a P5 member of the Security Council, and it's a P5 member with good ties, strong influence over Iran. There, too, they can play something of a moderating role. The other question that people raise is, will China become a more significant player in the region because of the American vacuum, because of the economic crisis? And the answer is probably yes, but we're talking primarily on the economic level. China hasn't made a major effort to date to become a diplomatic or military player in the region.
Understood. Some of our reporters are taking us back to annexation. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, really the main focus of the news cycle at the moment. Given everything that you've said in terms of the pessimistic regional context and the international crisis continuing to fight the pandemic, except for in New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, which they're doing quite well, how would you suggest the politicians actually proceed if annexation isn't the way?
Well, I don't think that an unplanned, unthought of policy, which is, to my way of thinking, counterproductive, it's shooting oneself in one's own foot. We are in control of the West Bank today. The Arab countries, the international community, have partly tired of the Palestinian cause, and their attention has partly shifted away, or even maybe they're partly less interested, but their attention has greatly shifted away. We're bringing their attention back to this issue and doing it in the worst way possible. So I would say, don't do it. And if the Prime Minister is determined to do so, then it should be the minimum action possible. And it should be in those areas that the Palestinians also recognize will remain part of Israel in a final status agreement. The settlement blocks, at least part of the Jordan Valley. But to go and do this unilaterally, to stick our fingers in everybody's eye, is unnecessarily provocative. I don't want to say it doesn't change anything on the ground, that this is pure symbolism, because it is determining facts on the ground. But it's largely a symbolic act, since nobody's challenging our control today in any event.
You mentioned the Jordan Valley, and I'm assuming that's not just because of the episode on House of Cards that you must have seen that dealt with the topic. So what you're saying is, if Israel were to come to some sort of understanding, which was bilateral and not unilateral, on the Jordan Valley and specific parts of the West Bank, that would be something that could bring us forward. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, the Palestinians in the negotiations back in the day, in the 90s and the early 2000s, recognized that there would be mutual land swaps. And President Abbas spoke openly of 2.9% of the West Bank being a land swap. So let me round that off to 3%. And Israel was talking, depending on who in Israel you were talking about, it was 4 to 6% in those days. Barak wanted 4%, Olmert wanted 6.5%. The difference between 3 and 4 or 3 and 6.5, it's not just a numerical difference, okay? That's real lives on the ground, Israelis and Palestinians. But that was a gap that I think could have been bridged in negotiations. To come along and do this unilaterally is a violation of decades of accepted practice.
Okay, I think we're all in understanding. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
It's going to be an interesting few months.
Yes,
it'll be a lot to report.
For anyone expecting a quiet summer, won't be.
Change your vacation plans.
Right. All right, Professor Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone else who joined. You should receive an invitation shortly for our next webinar in this series with Chairman of Commanders for Israel Security and former Home Front Defense Minister Matan Vilnai, who also happens to be Israel's most recent ambassador to China, this Thursday at noon. All right, goodbye for now.